Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Lots of work has gone into putting this roundtable together for you. I'm really excited to be sharing some amazing people's experiences and knowledge. We're just so excited to be hosting this from a Montash empowered perspective as well. For those of you who aren't aware, Montash Empowered was started as an initiative to really push and spotlight people who might not always get the opportunity to speak, but that have absolutely valid and innovative and exciting ways of thinking and lived experiences, etc. So through Montash Empowered, we are bringing you the roundtable today. The purpose of the roundtable, as the title indicates, is to really discuss how AI impacts gender bias. And I think it raises a lot of questions around bias as a whole, and what we're doing to ensure that the work that we're doing with AI right now remains ethical, etc. So going to give you a very quick overview on how this webinar is going to run. I'm going to get through this introduction and then I will introduce you to our lovely panelists. I'll give you a quick overview of the running order, what you can expect topic-wise from us, and then we'll really get into it and we'll let all our fabulous panelists chat through some of these topics of conversation. We then really want you to get involved as an audience. I would love to see you get involved with the Q&A at the end. And yeah, we'll wrap it up nicely for you at that point. So just want to say again, a huge thank you to our panelists for joining us. And yeah, at this point, I'd like to introduce them. Darren, do you want to kick us off with an introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Paige. My name's Darren Henry. I'm a co-founder of a relatively new company called Intelligenta Digital. I've been working in analytics and insight for about sort of 25 years, but for the last 15, I've been sort of focusing down on conversational AI. And within the last 5 years, actually sort of leveraging sort of data to drive different conversational AI deployments. So that's me. Julia?
Sure, yeah, I'll go next. So hi, my name is Julia Crook. I am a senior data scientist at a company called Bombora that's based in New York City. And I'm also affiliated with a lab in Stanford NLP group. My background is actually in vision and language in AI and machine learning with a specific focus on what we call computational social science. And those are all fancy ways of saying that I deal with a lot of different data and I care about AI safety. I also work for Bombora. I apply ML techniques to the ad tech space. And yeah, I really care about this subject because my background is on this, and I am really excited to see more alignment between research circles and industry circles on how to make our technologies better serve the communities they have contact with and be safer in general.
Cool. Shall I go next? Lenara? Hi, I'm Lenara Aliyeva. I'm executive advisor at Thoughtworks digital consultancy. So my focus is on digital and data-driven transformation, increasingly AI transformation. And I help executive teams to understand both challenges and opportunities associated with that type of transformation. And what I find, issues like AI fairness, AI gender bias that we're talking about can easily derail overall digital efforts. So I'm really keen to discuss and bring the leadership organizational perspective to this topic. Claire?
Sure, absolutely. I'm thrilled to be joining this panel and to be here with my colleagues. I'm Claire Centenat. I am a strategic data science leader. I've spent the last decade or so building and scaling data science teams across private equity, healthcare, and tech industries. Most recently, I established and built the data science team and AI Center of Excellence at Bain Capital, one of the world's leading asset managers, where we pioneered innovative AI solutions that delivered significant business value to our investing teams and portfolio companies. Previously, I've held leadership roles at organizations like Blackstone, Flatiron Health, pharma subsidiary of the Roche Group, and Spotify. At the moment, I've recently moved out to the Bay Area, joining some of my other peers out here. We're in advising startups building with AI. I love working with the startup scene, founding teams, helping them realize their product's potential with generative AI and push the boundaries of what these foundation models are really capable of. My background spans both technical work in academia and building apps that drive real business value. And I really focus on helping companies really achieve and realize that value with data science. Again, always happy to connect either during the Q&A or after this about others putting AI to work. And yeah, of course, thrilled to be here. And with that, I'll pass to Rich.
You're on mute. First one of the day.
Hello, hi. So I'm Rich Taylor. I work for NinetyOne Asset Management. I'm looking at AI and machine learning across the organisation, so covering investments, but also human capital, sales and marketing, the whole business. Prior to working here, I spent the last 5 years at a startup where I was one of the initial founder members. Grew that business. And prior to that, I've got a background working in financial services, worked for Barclays, and did a master's in astrophysics at the University of Manchester, working with cosmological simulations. So, yeah, come from that kind of background too.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Lovely. So, brief running of the running order, I suppose. There are three sort of main topics that we've boiled this down to. And we've titled them as such. So first and foremost, why should you care? And who is actually using AI at the moment? Who is responsible for bias in AI? And how could AI positively impact gender bias? I think three really meaty discussions there. So we'll do our best to get through those, but lots of interesting points. We're expecting this discussion to really explain to you why this topic is important. Not just this topic, but discussing bias and ethics in AI in general, and just bringing that to the forefront of your mind, because I know a lot of you are going to be actively thinking about how artificial intelligence can impact your business specifically. And I think these topics of conversation just need to be there when you're planning that approach. We want to make sure that we're also leaving you food for thought about how you personally can influence our industry and create some change for good. So first order of business, I think, is important to outline what bias actually is, because we're hearing it a lot and not everybody knows. And there's also 1,000,000 different ways that people might explain what bias is. So for us and for the purpose of this conversation, we are defining bias as systematic errors or unfair outcomes in AI systems, often stemming from biased data or algorithms, leading to discriminatory or inaccurate results which affect specific demographic groups. A bit wordy, but I think that's a fairly good outline. And on that, if we kick off with why should you care about any of that, Lenara, I think you've got some excellent points to make.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe I bring a personal story. So recently I asked ChatGPT to draw a picture of me based on our interactions, professional interaction, and it drawn a picture of a male in a suit. I thought we know each other well after 2 years of chatting. I don't look like a male, so I know it's funny, but that's kind of happening to a lot of us. And then we've got examples very well known in the media. So we all heard about, a lot of us have heard about the Amazon hiring algorithm, which prioritized male versus equally qualified females. Then in the financial sector, topics of the financial inclusion, we hear consistently women get either higher interest rate or lower credit limits versus the males with identical or very similar financial profile. We can carry on to so many industries where it impacts. But ultimately, obviously, we are talking about it. It's a social issue. It's not good for society, but it's also not good for business, right? From a business perspective, you potentially alienating large chunk of your potential or existing customers, your large part of demographics that your product impacting. And there are reputational damage, brand damage. We're all talking about it because this media does a great job in often, giving the spotlight to those cases. And then from a legal perspective, in some jurisdictions, especially in Europe, this is borderline discrimination. So as a business, you certainly should care about AI gender bias.
Yeah. To add on to that, I think it's important to note that Lenara offered a really amazing example with the AI hiring case in a way that biases that are ingrained in our systems can cause direct harm to people, right? But I think it's very important to notice, we know that AI systems, the algorithms that we use these days, they are what we call data hungry. And what that means is that a lot of historic data is used to train them. And without appropriate auditing, what happens is that they extend and actually weaponize the existing prejudices and the institutionalized discrimination that has been present in our society up until this point, right? And that is a very general statement on how it can be harmful. But another very important thing to note is that your specific application of your AI system can have varying degrees of harm. And a good way to, start reasoning about how can you predict this kind of harm, if you're going to plan how you can audit for it and potentially intervene and mitigate it, is take a look at that application, right? So two things really come into play here at a high level is how many levels removed in the process is your AI system from your consumer, right? And that will give you an idea in which places can you intervene. And of course, how much of an impact does this have on a person's individual well-being? I'm going to give an example, right? So Amazon hiring is one of those that directly impacts a candidate's potential to be, further interviewed by the company. So that, of course, impacts their future. But I'm going to give an example from the US. There is a system called Compass, and I'm probably not going to remember what all these acronyms mean, but it's essentially like correctional officer management profiling. And what essentially was made to do was to predict how likely someone who was previously incarcerated or currently incarcerated asking for parole is likely to offend again. So that is something that has incredible, astronomical impact on a person's well-being and has previously been found to be incredibly biased racially as well as relevant to gender. So these kinds of things, there are two aspects there, right? It's how many levels removed, so you have opportunities to intervene, and how much of an impact you have on a person's holistic well-being if you, for example, are biased or make an incorrect or unexpected output.
Really interesting points. And actually, I'm going to flip back to Lenara, because I think you had an interesting point to make here in terms of the kind of current wave of DE&I backlash and how that might actually worsen AI gender bias.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a bit of a hot potato, right? The DEI backlash. It's a big topic, especially in America. We're hearing the appetite and interest in any kind of diversity initiatives diminishing. And ultimately, what it will result is actually to exacerbating the bias, the gender bias, because what it will result in is in slashing the budgets. So less budget, that means less effort to audit for the AI products for bias, either before releasing to the market or while in the operation. We actually chatted with Julia about it yesterday. So I thought it's more of a hypothetical issue. We know it's not hypothetical, it's actually real. This was an article a few days ago in Wired, how this very influential US AI Fairness Institute, how it has to remove any references to AI bias, AI fairness, completely disincentivized to prioritize this, and that will ultimately impact the consumers, will make gender bias worse, and ultimately will result in negative outcome for the business, the way I see it.
Yeah. And if I may just take 2 seconds to provide a little bit more background on that. So the lab that I'm affiliated with in Stanford, my advisor has faced quite a difficult time period, because if you're a computational social science lab, and essentially we do a lot of NLP and multimodal research in the kind of like AI for good space, safety and trustworthiness and decreasing bias in our systems. We've had projects making sure that our systems are not discriminative against AAVE, which is African American Vernacular English. What we've seen is a lot of systems are actually very sensitive to dialects, and also like blending of cultural groups. You know, if you're an immigrant and you're maybe mixing some parts of your language with the with English. What we've seen is that there is a fund on grant applications in the NSF that contain any DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion terms. And that has affected us so broadly that so many groups in the academic space are now thinking how they could potentially petition for private funding so they could continue doing their work. And I also want to state that this is exactly the kind of community that has motivated a lot of research, that has guided deployers and developers on how to release AI technologies to market, and has done a lot of work on exposing potential pain points and avenues for harm before we actually go through the lived experience of discovering them. So it's really sad, and it's very much a real thing, and it's happening incredibly fast.
Yeah, absolutely. Just one point to it. So obviously what businesses do in the private sector, they mirror what's happening in the public sector. They very much follow. And if this is what's happening in public domain, what's the incentive for individual enterprises to prioritize it? The incentives are driven by shareholders, so even less. So the picture is bleak, to be honest.
Hopefully we end up leaving this roundtable with a slightly more positive call to action. But Claire, I know absolutely has some really interesting points to make, more so in terms of who's using AI, right?
Right, absolutely. I think my colleagues outlined like really beautifully some of the problems with having a lack of diversity in teams and product teams building with AI, as well as what that can mean in the outcomes of automated decision systems that might have a bias inherently built into them. I think Compass and the Amazon hiring system are some of my favorite archetypal examples of this. As someone who's building more generative AI products and looking at usage of those products, though, what is a little bit alarming to me is that we see pretty consistently and around the world that men are using generative AI tools like ChatGPT much more so than their female peers. In fact, in a very recent study that came out from Harvard Business School just recently, they found that women are adopting AI technologies on average about 25% less than men. And that pattern is very, very consistent across regions, industries, and job roles. As late as last year, the New York Fed introduced generative AI tools into their workforce and found that roughly half of their male workforce had experimented with generative AI tools, while only a third of their female workforce had. Some of the raw usage stats as well are really shocking. Around the world, only 42% of ChatGPT users are female, and only 27% of mobile app downloads, which is really shocking when you have such clear gender disparities. There's no real good answer as to possibly why this is the case. Obviously, there's lots of surveys that have been done to try and understand female hesitancy around using these tools. It appears that one key factor is going to be perception, and certainly comfort. And I think we've seen that. I think even anecdotally, many people in this room or on this panel could report those types of instances. In more recent surveys, women are much more likely, it seems, to worry that using tools like Claude or ChatGPT could be seen as cheating or not doing the work themselves. In my own experiences in leading DS teams and mentoring data scientists, I've noticed that women sometimes are more cautious with them and are more inherently worried that the output might contain bias, or relying on it could be frowned upon. And male associates, at least more broadly, on the other hand, seem to be keen to dive in faster, even if the tool is highly experimental. The reason why this this particular worries me is that if this gender disparity exists and is related to some perception of AI tools, it could have pretty systemic impacts economically and on productivity going forward. If half the population is slower to adopt what we know to be transformative tools, they really risk missing out on the now very well documented productivity gains that these tools can provide. In particular, this HBR study warns that if women continue to shun generative AI, it could widen existing gender gaps in skills, wages, career opportunities. We could see even greater gender disparity in engineering and data science teams than we already do. And then to Lenara's point, there's some real commercial benefits to this too, right? If companies lose out on productivity gains of a large portion of their workforce is not using generative AI, which we know to be so transformative. Some of the benefits that are part of that revolution, like higher pay, promotions, and new opportunities for women, could even exacerbate existing gender wage gaps. To echo a more positive note, possibly, Paige, is that what I think is exciting about this is that we're still really, really early in the days of generative AI. And we can take steps now to really change the nature of that trajectory. We can take steps like making the tools more accessible and welcoming to others. I think organizations really have an impetus to create environments where people feel safe to experiment with generative AI and do so without judgment. I think training and awareness panels such as this one can change a lot of the perception around these tools. And just generally having a more open discussion about adoption could help improve this. So I kind of agree that there's, I kind of agree that the picture is a little bit bleak right now, but I'm optimistic by the fact that it's still early enough that we can change the tide in a significant way.
100%. Thank you, Claire. That's really interesting. And like you say, I'm very hopeful that panels such as ours pop up more and more and more, and we can continue just to make space to just bring these things to the table. Because if I was watching you talk just then, the first thing I'd be doing was jumping on Copilot and finding out what I've missed. So look, I'm going to move into topic 2 here, which is who is actually responsible for all this bias? It's a bit of a basic question. But either Claire or Darren, I know you were going to talk to us about the question of, is this inherent in the source, or has it been introduced?
I'll go first. So from my perspective and the work that I do, I'm looking at behavioral data. I'm looking at a lot of corpus, text, voice analytics, what people are saying on the web. And for me, with the models that are being created and they're sort of sourcing these data sets, for me, I feel it's inherent in a lot of those data sets that there are biases that actually sort of people don't really understand or actually sort of think about. And as a consequence of this, you get a butterfly effect, where effectively there was a question from Talib, does AI mirror or is it a magnifier? And for me, within the data, if you're not understanding it properly and you're not treating it, and there is a positive, we're at a stage now where it can be treated. If you don't treat it, it can actually sort of magnify the issues. So for me, in a lot of cases, it's actually inherent in the data sets. You just need to understand it. But Claire, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, automated decision systems and AI more generally has a real possibility to magnify existing bias for the sheer reason that automated decision systems can make decisions without being interpretable in a black box way, in ways that we don't understand. They can do it much more quickly and they can do it more cheaply. So at scale. In the example of the Amazon hiring system, you might have a single, let's say, human resume reviewer that has some bias encoded in their wetware that can only do so much damage when reading or scanning resumes. An automated decision system that's doing this for all candidates at scale that has some inherent bias coded into it that's not very well understood, possibly less understood than human bias might be, can then just exacerbate these in a massive and in this case publicly embarrassing way for Amazon. So yes, I think it's really important to build cognizantly when you're creating these systems. And I think in large part, some of this bias could possibly be more effectively mitigated, or we could prevent it from being introduced by having more diverse teams that are building AI tools. We know that AI tools can reflect the values and blind spots of their creators. And when we have engineering teams that are overwhelmingly male, I think the most recent stat is 12% of AI researchers and 6% of software developers globally are female. And so when we have these really high gender skews in the teams that are actually building the tools, they're much more likely to encode their inherent bias. Certainly, I hope at least not intentionally, but it's likely that these blind spots and privilege hazard can be introduced into the systems like we've seen.
Yeah, I think that is an amazing point that I'm gonna, expand upon a little bit, Claire. But that it is just true to say that if you look at the developers and deployers of these systems over the past 20 years, they are a very cohesive mass when you look at the demographic and the background of these individuals. And that is not an attack. It's just, how a lot of these communities have been designed thus far. And there are a lot of negative impacts that can arise when you have a pretty big disparity in positionality. And that is, positionality is a term that is frequently used in the human-computer interaction or human AI interaction space. If there is a difference in positionality, that essentially means, how well could you potentially foresee the perspectives and the needs of the community you are servicing? So I'm going to give an example. You might have a team of developers that by nature, if they're developing tools that are supposed to help individuals who are visually impaired, you have a very drastic difference in positionality. Because by virtue, you cannot fully understand, no matter how much study you do or research you do, unless you interact and work with that community in developing your product, nothing trumps lived experience. Nothing. And it doesn't matter how much passion you have or how much you read. And I think that that is something that when we develop and also plan to deploy products, we really have to keep that into consideration. Develop channels of communication with the community that you are hoping to serve products to, involve them in internal A/B testing, make sure that there is a clear line of communication between the two so you can, estimate as best that you can, that you actually know what the pain points are and that you are addressing them accordingly.
And thank you, Julia. I wanted to follow up on that topic that yourself and Claire calling out, which is really big one, about lack of diversity, and bring it back to DEI. When we hear some of our major technology leaders talking about the need for masculine energy in developer teams, in AI teams, it will just make the problem worse, unfortunately. What's the incentive to build the more diverse teams?
Yeah, diversity is strength by a lot of measures. And, hire diversely as much as you can, but even in those cases that you can't, then make sure that you have contact with the community. Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay. Do we feel we've covered our topic 2? Darren, did you want to get any more into bias in data or?
Just bear with me. Can you hear me okay? Yeah?
Yeah, I can hear
I have problems with my microphone. I think it's just literally, everyone's sort of, there was a new model launched yesterday, and I can't even remember what it's called now because I'm losing track, or I'm getting old, or a mixture of both. But essentially, there's so many models coming up nowadays. A lot of the time, sort of for me, it's about, yes, it's built on 1 billion parameters, great. It's good that you're doing that, right? But for me, people need to sort of really start to question, where's the data trained? Where's the data from? Where's it trained? So anyone who's using AI in a customer function, or anyone who's using AI in a personal life as well, you really need to ask yourself, actually, where's the data coming from, and actually, is it legitimate, and is it a true reflection on actually what it's meant to be representing? So it's a bit like market research samples as well, right? Just question the data, because at the minute, I think everyone's just rushing to the technology and jumping on the technology hype, bandwagon, true potential of it as well. They're not factoring in these hygienics that you absolutely need to do. So for me, any data that we're looking at from a large language model, or even some of the sort of small language models that we're starting to build, we've got a series of standard questions that we're looking at around sort of the credence of the actual data that they've been built on. So to that way we can just reassure ourselves that we were taking the right approach, and actually with the responses, and we'll come on to testing later, the responses that we're getting from the AI systems or the decisions that they're making is actually ones that are most appropriate for the use case that you're targeting, really. So for me, you know, if everyone had a base understanding of being able to assess the quality of a data set that's been used to train an AI system, I think that's going to be a good thing.
I think I'm going to jump in here and talk a bit about this data aspect. That also kind of then leads into topic 3 as well, around how could AI positively impact gender bias? Because what we're talking around here is, I suppose, you know, obviously there's the data that models are trained on or that are used to feed into your model on inference when you get the result out the other side. And these biases, so there are biases obviously that exist in the real world. And you can't have a bias without a reference to something. Fundamentally, it's when something's imbalanced or unfair. So, you know, what's the reference point that we're talking around? And that's really important in understanding, is this data actually biased or not? Is it a true reflection of the real world? No. But that's one point. Obviously there are biases that exist in the real world. Okay, so like gender bias that we're talking around here. We want to if you want to fundamentally change and shift and like help to remove that gender bias, then there are different stages that you'd have to go through in the implementation of your model in order to be able to drive the outcome that you want at the end of the day. And having a clear idea on what that outcome is fundamental as well in developing the system that you're to drive that outcome. So, you know, first of all, there's the bias that exists in the real world. Then there can be bias that's introduced in the capture of that real world data. So similar to what you're saying, Darren, potentially, you know, you might be seeing a bias in the data, but it might be an accurate reflection. It could be a bias that's introduced. And as you pass the data through your process, you know, that we need to be very careful that we're not introducing or exacerbating those biases that exist in the real world and are actually driving the outcomes that we want to achieve fundamentally. So, you know, helping to remove those biases. And lots of these things that we're talking around, for example, with regards to gender bias that exists in the workplace, you know, well those things can help to be identified through these kind of systems as well. Like you can look at a bias within a team or a bias within different functions in your organization and say, well, how can we drive the desired outcome that we need? And very much to your point, Julia, around, you know, how diversity is fundamentally beneficial. Like, you know, we need to first of all, measuring things properly. Like that's the fundamental. Okay, like we need to measure things properly and then consider how we take the information that we've gleaned, as I say, to drive the outcome that we want, and be very cognizant of how we're processing the information along the way to not, as I say, exacerbate the issues that already exist in the real world, and in fact drive them in the opposite direction towards the outcomes that we want.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because one thing that we absolutely have to remember as people who are responsible for bringing these technologies to communities that don't have technical backgrounds and are using them for everyday purposes. Yes, we know that a lot of the biases come from the data that we expose these models to. However, it's important that we understand that blaming the data a lot of the time is a poor argument. And what that comes from is not that that's not the reason they're biased. A lot of the times that's exactly what it is. But there is a difference between explanation and justification. So I'm going to tell a quick story. There was an incident, I think this was 2017, where there was a very popular computer vision data set that when people started using it, they noticed that there was a dramatic skew toward white presenting individuals, and technologies like facial recognition technologies that were trained on that data set, therefore were like completely non-functional to different skin tones. And on Twitter, where a lot of these things in the research community is discussed, surprisingly, there was a discussion at why this is happening. And Jan LeCun, who is now chief AI scientist at Meta and also is a professor at NYU, he stepped up and explained, well, this is happening because there's biases in the data. And I think that as researchers, it's always our first instinct to be like, oh, we uncovered why this is happening. But to the general public, no one cares if it was the data or the model. What they care about is that it wasn't caught until it negatively impacted people. And so the biggest thing that we should take away from here is like Rich was saying, you need to have ways of measuring this and catching it before it actually goes out the door and negatively impacts somebody.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you all for sharing. That's extremely insightful. So lots of information here already. We've covered why this is important already. Hopefully you guys are on board with this now. And we've also covered, where is this bias coming from? And I think, as you can see, lots of different opinions. In all cases, everyone is right and everybody has a point. But I think it's really important that we put all of those things together. And as just to echo what Julia said, we're working so that none of the products that we're building amplify harm. And that is the most important thing. And that's what's brought us all together here is to really do our bit in making sure that doesn't happen. So on to something positive and innovative and change making. Let's kick off a conversation about what we can actually do to utilize AI and positively impact things like gender bias. Rich, would love to just hear your thoughts in terms of driving those outcomes towards a desirable end state.
Yeah, well, we need to know what we want to achieve, simply. And I mean, it sounds simple, but it's often quite complex and nuanced. So, like having, for example, having a gender split of 50% within a team that's a simple, final outcome that you might want. But then, like, what we need to do in order to get there, like, what are the levers that we have available to us in order to be able to drive that outcome? So that one thing is, obviously, there's understanding your situation to start with, as I was speaking to, understanding, what's the gender bias that exists. Then I suppose what's the gender bias that exists not just within the organisation, but in that sector in the real world, because there are going to be challenges on the hiring front. So what kind of factors do we need to take into consideration to drive the outcome that we want within the organisation, based on the fact that there are challenges in the outside world? So, things like that. Maybe you need to actually interview, obviously a larger percentage of females than you might naturally get through your hiring pipeline, for example. So, there are things that you need to consider, and yeah, so it's not just the data. It's, as I say, it's what are the levers that we've got available to us in order to be able to actually drive the outcome that we want. So yeah, I mean, as I said before, you need to be very careful if you're developing a predictive model for something not necessarily like the hiring situation, but a predictive model that might affect maybe your clients or your consumers at the end. Like in a similar regard, if you want to drive the outcome, it's not necessarily just as simple as we need to make sure we contact the same number of people of both gender. Like, there might be other kind of factors that you actually need to you need to understand the problem to start with. You need to understand not just the data that's going in, as I say, the ways in which you can drive the outcome that you want at the end of the day. So what are the factors that you've got to your hand in order to be able to drive that outcome? So yeah, it's a fun and interesting thing to be involved in at the end of the day. There's a lot of potential to be able to make a huge impact through this kind of technology, which is very much worth remembering. It's powerful in lots of regards, and powerful very much in this regard as well, as a tool to be able to drive gender equality. So
yeah, I think those conversations being had by the clients who are building their tools, and then being able to share some of those outcomes. This is what we were driving, and this is the end state we were looking at, and these are the problems that we thought about, and keeping those lines of communication as open as possible, as you given the corporate world, but trying to share that there are ways around it in your specific situation, whatever it is that you're looking at, and making sure that information is available to the general community so that we can take it, replicate it, improve it, make it applicable to whole industries, whole businesses, etc., etc. Really interesting. Julia, I know you are very knowledgeable in terms of the actual popular techniques that you could use to mitigate gender bias.
Yeah, so definitely happy to take it away from there. I also just quickly want to reiterate something that Rich said, right? Driving toward the outcome we want. And this actually is kind of an indirect answer. I noticed that there was a question in Q&A about, well, if the data reflects society and the biases reflect society, well, what gives, right? So I think that what it's our responsibility to do, and what I mean by our is I believe that the liability rests on the shoulders of everyone involved in the process. Until our legislative systems are going to be able to catch up to the way that technology is used now, and we know that they are inherently not designed to be fast, right? But until that we have legal procedures as to like who is liable under which case, I think that the appropriate attitude to hold is that in any stage of involvement, whether you are creating the data, researching the algorithm, you're an engineer working on a specific use case, you're the deployer running the final checks, I think it's best to proceed with liability throughout, right? We're all liable in some way. And effectively, what we want to create is we want systems that they don't reflect what society was the past 50 years, but they reflect what our values are now. And that's the kind of systems that we want to build. Because yeah, sure, our society was patriarchal for a very long time, but we are moving out of that. And we do, even though there are still a lot of gaps to be filled and we still have a long way to go, we are seeing progress. Even when we hit speed bumps with, the political sphere, for example, in the United States right now, the general trend is that we are growing more diverse and we see a lot of positive impacts on that. So the question is then, how do we actually do that? We're talking about how great it is. How do we do that? So there are a lot of ways of mitigating bias in data. So I'm just going to give one example, right? If you see that there is a gender bias, for example, of who is more likely to be a doctor, and you see a skew for men, we can actually go in and augment the pronouns that exist in the data and shuffle them to have a 50-50 representation, men, woman, or maybe more ambiguous or non-gender binary terms like they, them. Keep in mind, though, that that it's not possible for every language. There are languages that are incredibly gendered. A lot of Latin languages are like that. English, for example, though, is very conducive to it. But there are a lot of augmentation techniques that could be done to even out the signals that are present in our data, right? Also, if you have data imbalances, and this is to not get super technical, make sure that you even out representation. Like, let's say if you're training on stories of individuals and you know that maybe like talking about what kind of jobs people held in the 1960s is not going to be relevant for your use case in 2025, exclude that data. We are building algorithms that, are right now, they're very data hungry, but there are algorithms out there that are not as data hungry. Omit certain attributes that are too focused on a person's individual identity if they're not necessary. For example, if you are predicting whether someone should have a loan, maybe don't put gender in there. It's one of those things that you should do the analysis and see how much is this particular feature that is so tied to a person's identity, how much is it actually helping our systems? A lot of the time you'll find that if you remove it, it draws enough information from everything else that you don't have a performance dip. And I think that's leading me to the one final statement I'll make is that data a lot of time is to blame, but you should also look at the algorithms you are using. There are some that are more prone to overfit, and overfit is a very technical term, but essentially they're more prone to latching on to some signal in the data and being unable to generalize past that. So they are more likely to exhibit biases. So I guess all this to say is that there are mitigation steps both in data and in the algorithms as well.
Yes, wonderful. I was like snapping and cheering during that. I absolutely agree with everything that Julia said. I think our method and the algorithms we choose is so important. And this is a really natural segue for me to talk about a subject that's really near and dear to my heart. I started my research in causal inference and interpretable AI systems. And I think we don't talk enough about the need for interpretable versus black box models in some of the algorithms that we're introducing. Um, First of all, interpretable systems, which are systems that we can diligence and ask questions of how they came to the decisions that they came to, um, are very useful, not just in mitigating gender bias, but I would argue that they have general utility in business decision making. Any practitioners or data scientists on this call, I would invite you to go to a senior leadership team and tell them to implement some big strategic initiative just because your model said so. Any highly skilled operator is going to have questions about the nature and how you came to that decision, as they should. And that's where an interpretable system or interpretable model can really help you explain how you arrived at the answer that you did. In terms of mitigating gender bias, in the example that Julia gave of an AI loan application that's determining if an application should be approved or not, an interpretable system would be able to say, maybe this decision was due to income level or credit history factors. And critically, it could also reveal if gender played any role in that decision. If a model is truly fair, then gender should be irrelevant in the decision making. And if gender or a proxy for gender, which is something else we need to pay attention to, did influence the decision, an interpretability tool would be able to pick that up in a way that a black box model could not. So I guess my song and dance and my takeaway is that we really need to be investing more research in model interpretability. I think any AI system, in order to be useful, is going to need to be explainable. And that's really the future, I think, of this field is going to go. And that could have very positive implications for gender bias going forward.
Yes, amazing. Darren, you were going to have a chat with us just about the lack of testing that you're seeing right now.
Yeah, I'll stop developing my black box AI model now because of what Claire said, but that's a joke. Look, I think sort of the key things, the one thing there were some questions going on within the Q&A that was talking about testing and how do you analyze it or how do you identify it. You know, sort of, if I give an example, I think you just need to sort of really have a good understanding of what the from an input perspective, actually, sort of, you know, what's going into it. But then equally, when the models are sort of kicking out an output, you need to really understand, you know, sort of what should it be, not just based on your view, but basically the collective view as well. So I think Julia mentioned about doing a lot of A/B testing. And if I can give you an example, in conversational AI, we've probably already used crap chatbots in our time. There's a new wave of technology coming in, it's Gen AI, it's giving better outputs. But and that's an area that I'm involved in quite a lot, but when I actually look at the automated testing platforms, it's not controlling for any type of gender bias. It was just basically checking that the answer was correct. But if you're sort of using prompting that basically says, you know, answer in a particular way, the automated tests don't cover off, you know, are you checking for gender bias? Are you checking for ethnic biases? Are you delivering an expected outcome versus actually what you've modeled as well? So a lot of the automated testing can be optimized to cover off gender biases and any bias that you've got a focus on, but it's not been implemented yet. So I guess, you know, in this call, it's actually, if you're involved in conversational AI, do program that into your prompting for your tests, because actually it's going to sort of safeguard you in the future, particularly relating to Dr. Bauer's sort of comments around the EU AI Act and what that's going to mandate people to do as well. So yeah, just have that into your automated testing, I guess is what I'd say.
Thank you. And Lenara, I know you're very much involved in the role of leadership and shaping the future of AI. So do you want to just give us your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously we as a group got the best intentions. A lot of people in large organization got best intentions, but ultimately it's leadership that sets the tone, right? Which mandates what the priorities should be. So I think my key takeaway, if any leadership members, executive members watching this webinar, is actually treat AI fairness, AI gender bias like any major risk, because every organization rushing to release AI products, and obviously in that rush, it's easy to overlook important aspect. But if you treat AI gender bias, AI fairness in general as a risk, like any major risk, like cyber risk, financial risks, then a lot of good will come out of it. So, and the colleagues talk about some really great techniques, like Julia talked about data augmentation techniques. Claire brought up great point on transparency in AI system. Darren talked about testing, but ultimately it all comes down to funding, investment, and priority. Till leadership that mandates make it a priority, like don't rush the product, make sure some of those techniques or all of them incorporated in your development cycle. So that's, I guess, takeaway. And another thing I wanted to brought up, so diversity is kind of close to my heart, as you can imagine. And it's not very popular topic right now, especially on other continent. I'm based in London, by the way. So, but we, as a group, I think we all made it very clear there is a business case for diversity. It's not just nice to have. There is a clear ROI for diverse teams, not just for innovation. You can't expect homogeneous group of developers come up with innovative products and great stuff, but it's also good for risk mitigation.
I think there's some really valid, interesting points there as well, Lenara. There's some stuff that you touched on previously around, like, with regards to the challenges. If you've got challenges from a shareholder's perspective, there's sometimes things can cost more. Obviously, there's maybe challenges from senior leadership. There are challenges in skill sets that are available. There's a lot of things that can make it difficult to create a truly equal, fair system, AI or machine learning system. But I think it's also important to remember fundamentally that this is something that us, as people that work in this space and people that are developing these types of technologies, have in our hands to be able to control, and we need to be cognizant of where the issues sit, and actually, tackle those challenges, like to help articulate to maybe to senior leadership what the benefits are of having a more equal workforce. Like, sure, this stuff's not simple, right? It's from in different regards. Okay, so not just from a technical perspective, but societal. Even outside of the workplace, it's something we all need to be working towards, helping to mitigate these kinds of biases. But fundamentally, we are the people that are going to do it. Like, people on this call, the people in the workplace, like, it's up to us. This technology is in our hands to be able to change the future fundamentally. As long as we're mindful of all the kind of different aspects that can sit in our way. It's not that AI is something that necessarily is out there, especially when you bring it into your organization, that's kind of running on its own, like a kind of Skynet system. We have the control today to be able to work towards, as I say, the outcomes that we want. So it's fundamentally it's in our hands to deliver the outcomes we want.
It's in our hands. I love it. I hope that's what everyone goes away thinking. It is in our hands, because it absolutely is. We've had loads of questions, so thank you so much for everyone throwing their questions in. If you've got any more, feel free to put them in. But we'll try and get through the interesting ones. So whoever feels like answering, just jump in. I've had a question from Kasim. In the opinion of our panelists, is gender bias in AI primarily a data problem, an algorithm problem, or a societal issue?
All of the above.
It depends.
Yeah.
It really does depend. Yeah.
I was going to say we're going to be politicians in this one and sit on the fence, but it is actually correct to sit on the fence in this instance. There's different levels of bias within each of those areas, and it's just to Rich's point about it's in our hands. It's in our hands to understand it first, and then control for it. Across every single element, there will be bias, and as long as you just know how to manage it, or at least identify it, you're on a good starting point, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree, but I think I can order them by magnitude. I do still believe that data is the biggest pull. I believe that second would be algorithm. I think that societal impacts is very important, but it doesn't exist in the same paradigm. And I'm going to explain. No matter how much time you spend on your system and how careful you are as to for it to be unbiased or safe, the definition of unbiased and safe will vary drastically with your cultural and social orientation and what your background is. And there is no way ever to separate the technology from the will and the interests of the deployer. And what that means is that what we define as safe and neutral and trustworthy here, as opposed to here being, the UK or the US or in different parts of the world, is going to be different. So the societal issue is so it encompasses everything, but yes, it is something that we do have to think a lot about and think about how it impacts the technologies that we use.
Thank you so much. We've had another one from Jihad. So how do we, or how can we incentivize AI adoption amongst the women in our workforce?
Yeah, I love this question because I also think that this is an area that we have an ability to impact sort of immediately. I think one thing is definitely addressing the concerns around perception and comfort. If we can create more cultures and more corporate environments where we encourage safe experimentation with these tools and possibly remove some of the stigma associated with them, we can make them much more approachable to all demographics and populations of users, and including and especially women. I think we have a very long way to go in terms of training and awareness of these tools. There have been some more recent studies that have not shown that AI training has been that effective. But rather than discrediting training altogether, I think it's more of an indication that we have so much to go in making, so many ways to go in making this training more approachable to different groups. Mm-hmm. And then I think perhaps to bring it full circle back to our discussion on representation and data and product teams, I think there's possibly some, and this is not based on data or survey, but just my perception, I think there's some opportunity to make the design of these tools more approachable to different populations. I think overwhelmingly because you have possibly male UX designers or product teams, they're just naturally built to skew towards the usage needs of one population versus others. So I think, again, diversity in product teams could help build that further.
Definitely. Did anyone want to add anything?
I saw something recently. I don't encourage enforcing stuff. I think people need to want to see the benefits, and education is a massive part of this generally across the board. So and continuing to bang the drum as well. The training that's out there, maybe it doesn't stick first time, but continue pursue it, persevere. And obviously make that open to everyone. I also saw something kind of interesting recently that I'm not necessarily advocating for, but that this was in their annual review as part of their personal development program. It actually had an item for how are you using AI in your job, which just I suppose helps people to think about it as a tool. And I suppose there are many different ways kind of like that you can help just to encourage use generally, but also obviously for people that are using it less. So yeah.
So I'm just going to.
Interestingly, what I've seen with some of our teams internally at different different portfolio companies is that the framing of an AI tool as a co-pilot or a companion versus something that is going to automate processes or completely handle parts of your job itself autonomously ends up resonating much more with at least more junior women than some of the other ways that these tools are presented. So I think, to Rich's point, training is probably the biggest immediate lever in the framing of these tools.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to cut because I want to squeeze one more in, even though we're running behind time. Cassie has popped in and wanted to know, do you think that this trend is more related to the industries adapting to Gen AI first? So, for example, in tech, we probably use AI a lot more, but women might take up a smaller amount of the tech industry because of the natural bias.
That's an excellent, really thoughtful question, and definitely the first that came to mind. I mean, I think what is surprising is that even in studies that strongly control for gender disparities amongst different sectors or in different professions, they find that this discrepancy in usage is still very strong. There was only in this HBR study that was recently published, there was, globally and across industry, only one outlier group, which is in women in senior roles in technology, who were likely to use generative AI at equal rates to their male peers. But unlike their more junior female counterparts, who continue to use it at a lower rate than their male peers.
If I may add a little bit of a different angle, there is also hesitancy to admit the usage of any generative AI tools. There is ongoing layoffs. We know what's happening in the market, in the technology sector. So a lot of research coming about, and there was an interesting article from Ethan Mollick, is one of the big influencers in AI space, why a lot of employees, both genders, actually keeping the AI usage private, not revealing it because they're genuinely concerned. And I encounter it working with my clients, actually, as people are concerned. If I reveal that I use generative AI, what does it mean for my role? Am I going to be redundant? There are concerns like that. Maybe topic for another webinar.
Yeah, I think we've got more than enough to do another one. So, look, we've had loads of questions, but I am going to wrap things up. We've run out of time for anyone else's questions, but what we're going to do is try to follow up with some of the most insightful ones. We've had loads with comms coming out after the event. So anyone that's signed up and joined us today will receive further communication, and we'll try and get some of our panelists' thoughts on some further questions. So final thoughts I'm going to pass you over to. I don't know if you can succinctly, in a very flashy way, chuck out a cheeky tagline, but final thoughts. Darren, I'm going to come to you first.
Why? No, I'm going to echo Rich. It's in our hands, right? So that's me.
Yeah. Julia?
I would say final thoughts is that it's an ongoing process. It's one of those things that it's going to be a never-ending journey. And that's a beautiful thing, I think, because what we consider to be bias is going to evolve. And of course, this is a big, issue when it comes to gender bias, but it extends throughout, right? And the needs are always going to shift to align with what is happening societally. So I guess my parting message is enjoy the journey. There's a lot of utility in it. And I think that we're keeping people safe and we're making sure that the technologies that they use actually benefit them. So it's a fun place to be in.
Yeah. Rich, you've been robbed.
I've been robbed. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to think of something different from Darren, what you said, and what you said, Julia. It's fundamentally like, I'm going to kind of sit somewhere in between the two, right? Like it's fun. It's a challenge. There's a lot of intellectual stimulation that can come from solving these kinds of problems, but we have the power to be able to make these changes. So let's enjoy the challenge and keep curious. That's fundamentally what I think.
Yeah, this is a tough one because there are so many great points we talked about today. I think my biggest takeaway is going to be that we are still in very, very early days. It's a greenfield opportunity in this field. And because we're so early on, any positive changes that we make today, like a pilot shifting the trajectory of a plane by a few degrees, can have a huge impact on where we eventually end up in this field. And so my message is very, very positive, and I have a more optimistic outlook, in that any positive changes we can make today to mitigate or change the trajectory of bias in these tools can have an exponential effect on the future of this field. So I would just say to continue having these discussions, continue to be thinking around these issues, and it's likely to end up in a much better place than where we are.
And Lenara?
Yeah, I'll try also to add on a more positive note. Even so, my role is, as you appreciate, is focusing on risk, highlighting risks to the leadership, and that's why this topic is close to me. But listening to all these great, strong voices and discussing this topic, there is definitely a lot of positive. So I feel much more positive that this issue will be tackled appropriately. Not necessarily will be solved, but will be mitigated.
Yeah, and I think the general vibe is you don't have to solve all the problems, you just have to be involved in trying to make a more positive impact and a positive difference. And that's what's really resonating for me. So just want to say thank you so much to all of our wonderful, wonderful panelists. Obviously couldn't have done this without you. Thank you. And thanks to our attendees who have joined in, all your wonderful questions. There will be follow-up content, as I've mentioned. So you will be able to access a recording of the event. There'll be an event recap for you and access to any further discussions and other questions that we might be able to answer in the meantime. And we'll leave it there. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Good day.
Bye.